Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the CoveTalk, last Tuesday of the month for PME for 2nd Division here at the Randwick Barracks Officers Mess. The topic tonight, we're talking about the ethics of victory and how we actually define victory. And we're pretty familiar with how we do counterinsurgency and how we deliver those tactics in practice. And when we start looking at our opposition, the insurgents face the dilemma of either being present and influence effectively, and in doing so be targeted by us. Alternatively, they may go underground and survive, but have less influence. In neither way do the insurgents really win in terms of declaring a victory. Our typical security or military response could be called mowing the grass. Anything that pops up, we tend to trim it down, and in doing so apply military force to reduce those threats so as we can see them. But once we have done so, arguably, we fail to actually complete those tasks, and then we leave the political and social root causes for conflict unaddressed. In this way, the counterinsurgent may have won the tactical contest, but they too cannot really claim a victory. It's even worse for the counterinsurgent if they misapply political or social instruments or attempt to do so with military means, which could negatively transform the conflict, leading to new grievances and conflict recidivism. In that example, no one can claim victory. So how do we actually define and claim victory? Well, fortunately for us, we have an expert. Professor Cian O'Driscoll from ANU at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs has graciously come along to help us out with answering this question. I'll be your host, Major Jeremy Barraclough, for this evening, and this is part of our normal last Tuesday of the month Cove Talks, and it will be hosted out on the live stream and also archived on the Cove website. And I do encourage you to get onto the Cove social media so you can access these sorts of things. Throughout the presentation, the phone number will come up on your screen, and you can send in some questions to the phone number, and then hopefully at the end of the presentation, we'll be able to get Cian to engage with us and the audience we have here in the room for this evening. Cian does have an extensive CV and publishing record. I do encourage you to get onto the Cove and get onto ANU so you can find his readings. And I do encourage you to read it. And he will, hopefully at the end, provide us with a shameless plug for his book. And with that, arranged. Over to you, Cian. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you so much, Major Barraclough. Thank you. And thank you for the warm welcome and for hosting me today. It's been a real pleasure to visit from the winter that is Canberra at the moment. So this is a piece which was written by my colleague at the ANU, Matthew Sussex, in February of this year, asking, after 12 months of war in Ukraine, what does victory look like? Pieces like this are coming out fast and thick at the moment. I believe I circulated one in advance of this talk written by Mick Ryan just this week, asking much the same question, except obviously a couple of months later. These pieces and this kind of continual prompting of this question challenges us to ask, what is victory? What does it look like? What I want to suggest to you is I want to take a particular approach to how we engage it. I want to suggest that victory is an inescapably vague, slippery concept, and all the more politically resonant for that. In other words, it's precisely because victory is so vague and that it evades definition so totally that it's such a powerful political term, that it's so rhetorically appealing for politicians and for political leaders. But that very setup nudges us towards, I think, seeking a definition of the term. And this is certainly one way we could go. We could look to pin down, what do we mean by victory when we're talking about it? What does it look like? People like William Martell and others, and I'll put some of their works on the screen later, have written books and books about this, where they've delineated different typologies of victory: tactical, strategic, operational, so on and so forth, political victory, military victory. All of this work is very interesting and it's very productive in terms of allowing us to get a certain amount of precision in what we're talking about. But as I alluded to a moment ago, I'm keen for us to go a slightly different direction today. And I'm speaking about us because while I'm the one talking at the moment, I very much hope that this will be an interactive chat and that, you know, we all have stuff to say on this topic when we talk about something like winning or victory. But what I want to suggest, or how I want to suggest that we approach, is in a more synoptic manner, treating it as, and I want to use W.B. Gally's term here, an essentially contested concept. What this means in a nutshell is that we treat victory as a site of contestation. We don't look to narrow it down or to focus it, boil it down to one particular definition, but rather look at the different points of view which inform how we think about it and view them in the round, seeking to get a sense of what are the edges of this debate, what are the red lines, etc., etc. Within this, I'd suggest that there's probably three tightly fused, but nonetheless ever so slightly distinct questions at play that help us get a fix on what we think about victory. Those questions would be, what does victory require? What does it look like? And what can it deliver? Those questions all run together and they blur in, and to disaggregate them is to, in some sense, to do a violence to them. But we can nevertheless think about that just for heuristic purposes as we work through today. Different peoples at different times, operating in different circumstances, will weigh and indeed approach these different questions differently. It's in this difference, this interplay, I want to suggest that the political character of victory resides, which is where I think it's really, really interesting. And of course, coming to a place like this, it's fascinating for somebody like me because nobody spends more time thinking about victory than people involved in military activities. Kurt Lang's definition of militarism and civil military relations suggests military organizations are structures for the coordination of activities meant to ensure victory in the battlefield. This, of course, draws on a much longer tradition. We can go all the way back to Aristotle, and indeed Cicero riffed on this too, defining victory as the telos of military science. Victory is the proper end or the destination, the reason for which we study this field. Victory is the main object in war, Sun Tzu. In the piece I mentioned from Mick Ryan, victory is a central concept in our understanding of war just this last week. Yet, well, just one bookmark there to all of this. So while we're understanding that victory is absolutely fundamental or integral and underpins what we do and how we think about warfare, and indeed the very notion of warfare as we understand it, and if we were in a similar institution in France like Saint-Cyr, when you would go into your office in the morning, you would go under an arch saying in French, "We train you to be victorious." So victory seems to just guide and bound everything that's going on here. And yet there have been periods in the not so distant past when the word victory was excised from the military or strategic lexicon. Obama banned it from use in the strategic review in 2008, was it? And requested of his colleagues in the Obama administration that this term was not one that they would be using anymore. They'd be talking about success or objectives achieved and so forth, but not victory. We'll come to this in a moment. We'll come to the reasons why this might be the case in a moment. What I want to draw out here is that you've got a political discourse about victory, but at the same time, you've also got a sense that victory is absolutely fundamental to what's going on the battlefield. And yet, we don't have a clear understanding of what it entails, or of really what it might look like in practice. So what I'd like to focus on today is a little bit about the relation between victory and peace. And when it comes to the significance of this question becomes clear when you view it through the context of a case like Ukraine, where you might ask yourself, should we be thinking about victory through peace or peace without victory? Now this, I'm not sure if we'll be able to fully maneuver this in this slide, but oops, this is Elliot Cohen's, I won't be able to navigate the slide entirely, but this is Elliot Cohen's op-ed last week from The Atlantic. And if we could see the headline, what it would in fact say is that for Ukraine to win, Russia has to be defeated. And I want to try and pick out what he quite means by this, what this says for how we understand victory. Some of you might recognize this quote on the first screen. And by the way, the purpose, what we're doing now is we're trying to get behind Elliot Cohn's notion of, for Ukraine to win, Russia has to lose. This is George H.W. Bush's diary entry from the evening that they declared victory in the 1991 Gulf War. He's in his room alone and he's writing, "Still no feeling of euphoria. I think I know why it is. It hasn't been a clean end. There's no battleship Missouri surrender. This is what's missing to make this akin to World War II, to separate Kuwait from Korea and Vietnam." And very much driving this downbeat moment of confidence for the president is reports he's already heard on Iraqi radio that Iraq has won and that the Allies have been defeated and that they're departing with their tail between their legs. And Bush goes on to say in his diary, "It's such a canard, it's such an obvious lie, and yet nonetheless, it's going to get traction, isn't it?" He's concerned in this moment that precisely because they haven't cleanly defeated and been seen to emphatically and cleanly defeat Iraq, that Iraq hasn't had to, as it were, have its nose rubbed in the dirt, that this victory somehow wouldn't stick, that it would be easy for Iraq to wriggle off the hook and walk this victory back. That kind of danger was was not unprecedented. Going back to 1918, Friedrich Ebert greeting the Wehrmacht at the Brandenburg Gates, saying, "No enemy has vanquished you. You're coming home. Germany has lost the war, but we have not been defeated in the field." So whatever the nature of this defeat, or whatever, it's a political defeat, not a military defeat. And of course, we all know that this then laid the roots for, I suppose, subsequent generations of politicians and political leaders in Germany to say, that victory wasn't quite so clean cut. Maybe we weren't defeated after all. You know, maybe this was a betrayal at home, so forth and so forth. What we're drawing here is the lesson, so nicely articulated by the late Michael Howard: for a victory to stand, the defeated party must accept the fact of defeat. If they're not forced or obliged to confront the fact of defeat, that victory is sure to dissolve in time. This is, again, an idea, an insight which has deep historical roots. Jan Barbarac is best known as the translator of Hugo Grotius, the author of The Rights of War and Peace in 1625, sometimes understood as one of the architects of the Westphalian treaties. And Barbarac, glossing Grotius, wrote, "To be really victor, even when victorious, it's necessary that the vanquished should confess it." So again, it's not enough to win. You have to be seen to win. And for you to be seen to win, and for that win to be locked in and confirmed, the vanquished side have to lose. And they have to lose publicly, emphatically, incontrovertibly. This is, I think, probably best articulated the notion of peace through victory, that it's only with such a decisive, emphatic defeat that you can actually bring a war to a close in any kind of meaningful, substantive way. Now, these ideas evoke historical archetypes. Anybody know what this is in the front, the top image? Anybody in the room? This is the Greek battlefield trophy, right? And so it's a simple cruciform shape, just two wooden beams, one cross beam and a vertical upright, I suppose. And then how it operated was on the battlefield. Once one side set the other, forced the other to turn tail and break ranks and flee, that point where the other side broke ranks and turned would be known as the turning point, or the tropeion, which is where we get the term trope and trophy from. So once they had fled the battlefield at that point, the victor, who still owned the battlefield, who was still present, would drive this upright into the ground, hang a crossbeam off it, and then hang swords, shields, paraphernalia from the defeated enemy on this trophy. And what that did is that advertised that this war is over, we won and you lost. The pure fact that you can't stop us doing this is proof of your defeat and proof and confirmation of our victory. Very interestingly, this practice, I should say, only prevailed in intra-Greek conflicts. Yeah?
Is that similar, so the accepting of defeat, similar to going under the yoke?
Yes, the deditio or whatever in the Roman context. Yes, exactly. So there was a formal sense of you have been publicly forced to accept and concede defeat. In this case, of course, it wasn't so voluntary because they had been forcibly driven from the field. Now, once the trophy was up, you would think that the defeated side might have an interest or an incentive to go back and pull it down. But of course, they were forbidden from doing so by customs backed by the gods. Religious protocol and custom forbade them from doing so. So once that trophy was in the ground, it was there to stay. But by the same token, the victorious side was not allowed to repair or upkeep the trophy. They were not allowed to emboss it, to maintain it, to ensure that it lasted longer. The idea behind this being that as it's just made of wood and with leather and so forth wrapped on it, that this would, over a period of a generation or so, disintegrate, biodegrade into the earth, at which point the memory of this battle and of this rivalry would also be allowed to go. So there was a kind of planned obsolescence, a shelf life for war memory, so to speak. And this is how you marked a victory, but also how you let it go. The Romans had an interesting riff on this, as you know. This is an image on the bottom of the screen of the battle of the Roman triumph. When they won a campaign, the victorious commander would be hailed as imperator, could be hailed as imperator, conqueror, and thereby granted a triumph whereupon, upon his return to Rome, he would be allowed to process on a very formal, ceremonial, ritualized route through the city. There's a couple of interesting things about this here. Just checking how we're doing for time. One, they drove their captive and defeated enemy in front of the victory procession. So they were made to march in shame as captives before the kind of might of Rome. The other thing is they also took replicas of battlefield trophies. So from all the battles that they won in the campaign, they built little replicas of these and they carried them with the names of the battles in question on them. And this is a really significant moment in a particular way, because with the Greeks, you'll remember, there's a very limited shelf life. These are very particular mementos for very particular battles. Victory is understood as something that happened on a particular day in a particular place. Whereas what the Romans end up doing in appropriating it for this triumphalistic ritual is they actually, and in sequencing it alongside all the other battlefield trophies that they were calling, it essentially narrativized Roman conquest and the ascendancy of the Roman Empire, right? So you get this deterritorializing of victory. It becomes the story of Roman greatness and of its right to empire. All of these stories, I think, kind of underlie how we think about war in some way or other, or shall we say the mainstream historiography of war. It's right there in all of those great battles of history books that we read. What they do is they build into our imaginary of war a notion that war is battle-centric, and that in an ideal sense it ought to culminate in a decisive battle which settles the matter for once and for all, where there's a winner and a loser, and where that signals the end of the conflict, and where the loser accepts their defeat and goes home, and so forth. But there are pathologies that way of thinking about victory produces. And this is where I want to bring our second major player. So we've spoken a little about what we've just done is we've unpacked Eliot Cohen's account of victory. For Ukraine to win, the Russians must be defeated. Here's a second view which responds tacitly or implicitly to the pathologies of that approach. This is the Macron view, that we shouldn't humiliate Russia, that we need to be very careful in terms of how we prosecute or seek victory in this war. I'll just unpick a couple of images, unpick that idea through a couple of images, which I think are very helpful in drawing it out. Well, the first one is where we start. I think it's useful to start with Woodrow Wilson, as we've already mentioned the term peace through victory. Actually, sorry, let's start even prior. This is the Appomattox, ending the American Civil War. This is Ulysses Grant being very magnanimous in victory against, can anybody remind me? It was Robert E. Lee, wasn't it? Yes, it was Robert E. Lee. And this is often held up as the archetype, case in point, of a magnanimous, just victory. Why? Because Ulysses Grant decided purposefully not to humiliate the Confederate forces on the day. He allowed them to keep their personal arms, and as they were led out of the Appomattox County Courthouse, he warned his men that nobody should cheer, that the enemy was to be applauded. If there was to be a peace worth keeping after this war, the defeated enemy, had to be treated with respect and allowed to maintain their dignity, not humiliated. If you humiliate them, this will come back to bite us. Now that, of course, is the shining moment in some ways, which is then, of course, betrayed by certain aspects of the Reconstruction in American history, in which the promise of that magnanimous victory isn't quite realized. Enter Woodrow Wilson, a child of the South, of course, who had a certain first-hand bitterness towards the Reconstruction and towards the excessiveness of the politics of victory in the American South of that time. He brings that with him to the aftermath of World War I and into his argument that what we need, while the Allies were pushing for a war guilt clause and so forth, while the other Allies, he suggests, no, what we need is peace without victory. Precisely, he doesn't want Germany's noses rubbed in it in the same way that the South was, because he doesn't see this as a path to a viable peace. He sees this as sowing the seeds for future conflict. And indeed, the cartoon image here suggests that this is indeed how the Versailles Treaty has sometimes subsequently been understood, especially the war guilt clause built into it, where the Germans were forced to concede on kind of harsh punitive terms, embarrassed, so to speak. A couple of recent cases. This is, of course, a still image from the Highway of Death in the aftermath, the very end of the 1991 Gulf War. I think this image is interesting because, of course, the conversation that accompanied it in the Oval Office and in the Pentagon as it was taking place involved Colin Powell advising his peers that it would not look well for the United States if they were seen to be piling on after the whistle, that this was starting to look ugly, that people wouldn't see any honor in this, that a victory pushed too far would somehow start to undermine itself. This was the same argument that Barack Obama mobilized when he argued that his administration, or when he instructed his administration to avoid use of the term victory. He said something along the lines of, I'm quoting roughly, we don't use that term, it has unfortunate connotations of, Battleship Missouri and capitulation and the like. He precisely wanted to avoid exactly that kind of dynamic, exactly that kind of set of suggestions that Eliot Cohen and, of course, George W. Bush with his mission accomplished banner are precisely trying to evoke. The last one some of you will know is the Finnish envoy Matti Ahtisaari, who in the course of his mediations in the Aceh peace talks challenged some of the people in the room at a particular sticky moment in the negotiations. Do you want to win or do you want peace? The argument underpinning this seems to be that the very dynamics or mechanics of victory, where you have to rub the other guy's nose in it, you have to be seen to win, and to be seen to win, the other guy has to be seen to lose, that precisely that dynamic is injurious, actually doesn't advance peace, but is injurious to the prospect of it thereafter. So there seems to be a bit of a dilemma going on, or a kind of a Goldilocks, a dialectic, shall we say, at play, that for a victory to stand, it must be incontrovertible, such that the vanquished must be obliged, be forced to confront it, to admit it. If victory is insufficiently emphatic, it leaves room for the loser to wriggle off the hook and to backslide. But if a victory is too emphatic, such that it humiliates the losing side, it can undercut rather than advance, or rather than support the peace it's intended to produce. As such then, when the argument seems to be that one can seek victory or one can seek peace, but squaring the circle between them is, if not impossible, at least very, very difficult, and it requires a great deal of thought. And these, I think, are exactly the horns of the dilemma that we're focusing on, that we're confronting today when we think about Ukraine, and when we listen to people like Macron on the one hand and Elliot Cohen on the other. Both can be right. One of the ways in which it might be useful to engage these two, to mediate between these two positions, is to engage them through the sight of ethics, through the language of the just war tradition, and to engage with what that rich body of thinking has to tell us about the relation between victory, justice, peace, and order. But I think that this might be something which we can best leave for Q&A. And if people are interested, we can unpack the interesting, intriguing, problematic, but I think also very instructive relationship or place that victory occupies in just war theory and the ethics of war. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Ken. That was a very good and very informative presentation you've given us this evening. And you know, typically when we get academics out here, I start out with a very simple question, and thankfully you've not answered it at all, but you have pointed out that, you know, typically it's often a bit more complex than that. And I hope that we've all taken a lot out of that. And we do have questions available on the phone line, so please do text them through, and then we'll be able to present them to Ken and try and get them answered on your behalf. And as we're waiting for that to come in, I'll just sort of jump in, try and get us a bit rolling, and we'll pass the microphone in the room around here as well. And if you do grab the microphone, I just ask you wait till you grab the microphone. So going into some of the points, and I'm glad you went to Cohen, and I'm very glad that you brought up the Bush on the carrier with mission accomplished. Interestingly for me, you juxtapose Bush on the carrier and the conclusion of World War II with the Japanese, and we have the Allies and the adversary on the deck of the Missouri, you know, emphatically and clearly acknowledging the conclusion of hostilities there. So in that sense, have we forgotten to invite the enemy to our understanding of the conclusion of hostilities? Have we sort of lost our track, as in when we see significant leaders such as Obama advocating for measures of success rather than a theory of victory? Or is it just that military professionals need to go back and read some Clausewitz and understand that it's about, you know, making sure that the adversary is compelled to our will and consents and acknowledges that they're being compelled to our will?
Those are fascinating questions. One of the distinctions I gestured towards at the start is we could talk about victory in a strategic military sense, or we could talk about the politics of victory. To some degree, I think the image of Bush and the reference to Obama is the political account of victory. And I think that matters, because in this instance, this is an internal monologue for the United States in this particular instance. They're not inviting the enemy in. So George H.W. Bush is not thinking about the other guy, he's thinking about his dad. He's thinking about his dad's diary entry from 1991. His dad didn't get out in front and say, we won, you lost. And that was the mistake, and that's why they were back there in 2003 in his mind. So I think in trying to get out in front and say, we won, and to publicize this and to do it with on the deck of the Abraham Lincoln, that's precisely what he's trying to do. And in turn, that's exactly what Obama's turning away from. So you've got this seesaw, and of course Obama's followed by Trump, who famously tells us that we're going to have so much winning, you're going to be sick of winning, and so forth and so forth. The really interesting question that your challenge invites is, how do you insert some actual strategic thinking into this? And I don't know, I think this is part of the danger of that language of victory. It's just so politically attractive because it does such work. Everybody knows what it means. You don't have to, even if you can't articulate it exactly. So it's a very evocative, powerful rhetoric. And it always seems that we're playing catch up with political leaders and their sloppy usage of it.
Yeah, very interesting. And I do like how you brought out that there is a certain level of politicking to politics that we need to be cognizant of well. And it's not just the military how we act, it's also how we interact with our political leadership and the considerations they have too. So moving on from that, we've got one of the questions from online. He's asked, could you please give some historical examples where we've got the balance right, perhaps neither overdoing nor underdoing victory? And I guess inside that vein is you've given some examples, such as the conclusion of the US Civil War. That was a very good example. Indeed, we've just spoken about the good juxtaposition for the conclusion of the hostilities with the Japanese, where it was absolutely clear that peace was enforced. Is there a more recent example that we could take away from a Western audience or otherwise?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to indirectly or circuitously talk about the 1991 Gulf War. But before we go there, I want to go back, I suppose, to some of the just war tradition stuff I alluded to a moment ago. And in conversations before the session started, we had a nice chat, myself and a colleague, about St. Augustine. And I think St. Augustine is really key here. And we would do very well to remember his lessons. So he invites us to problematize both what we mean by peace and war. So peace, on the one hand, is a good. It's worth striving for. It's what prevents us, in his language, from eating one another like fishes. But on the other hand, the peace that we can have on this earth in the here and now, as opposed to the heavenly kingdom, is always a provisional, tentative, partial peace. It's riven with and shot through with injustice and disorder. So the peace is not kumbaya peace that we have here. It's a limited, provisional, sad status quo. But nevertheless, so far as it provides a modicum of order, it's worth preserving. If that's his problematization of peace, his problematization of war, is that war can help us preserve peace, but only imperfectly, right? It's a very basic, bloody, brutal means for so doing. And the most it can do is it can prevent worse things from happening for a particular period of time. War is not, in the Augustinian vision, a force for good in the world. It's not going to be a vector for human rights and democracy. It's going to stop bad things from happening for a period. It's bandages until perhaps you get some enlightened, well, we'll speak to that in a moment. Let's come back to 1991 Gulf War then. The world order as it was before Iraq invaded Kuwait was not perfect. Kuwait was not the perfect state, but nevertheless, there was an act of aggression and so forth. We can see that there was a case for taking collective defensive action in favor of Kuwait. The Allied action then was limited, right? It was curtailed. It was multilateral. It stuck within the rules, and it didn't push too far. And I tend to think that that's about as good as we can do. Now, the fact that that war subsequently oxidized Al-Qaeda and all the other lunatic fringe elements which then took down the more moderate regimes in the Middle East and laid the seeds for all the bad stuff that's followed, isn't on how the war was ended per se. Because all you can do, the best you can do with ending a war is create conditions for political leaders to make something of that limited peace you've produced, of that window of time, of that staunching of the bleeding. War is never going to deliver anything better than that. So in my casebook, I would go back to 1991 and say that was a good example of how to do this, and that isn't overlooking all the problems that came in the train of it, but just saying, yeah, that's about the best you can do.
Oh, thank you. Just look around if we've got a question in the room here.
You talked about the winning the war, but then there's the winning of the peace and to have the longevity of the peace. And I'm thinking back to Canada. 260 years ago, the British defeated the French on the plains of Abraham, and the following year, basically, the French all left, except they left all their people there. Now, 260 years later, they're still arcing up about being able to, have their own country, et cetera, as, wanting to separate from Canada. What's your perspective on that? And that, I guess, goes to the Civil War 100 years later as well.
I think the general perspective, and I didn't really draw this point out as fully as I would have liked, but it would be to go back to these frames and to say the aspects of war that enabled the Greeks and Romans, and for a brief period in the 17th century, particular set of European states, to use war for the historical conditions for war to operate as an instrument of decision are very time bound. And so all the kind of the trophy mechanism for the Greeks, for instance, and the notion of the decisive battle, these are contingent historical aspects and not general. And when we don't have them, it's very difficult to draw a clean line as to when war is over, who's won and who's lost. And I think the case that you've mentioned is a perfect example. More generally, you could talk about the rise of Napoleon and the levée en masse, and this idea of the nation in arms. And this is the point at which the notion of war as an instrument of decision really gets away from the military planners. Precisely because if you're involving the whole population and the whole demos and the whole nation and you're getting everyone up to fight, well, just because you lost on the day, it doesn't mean everyone's ready to go home or to give up on it. And you can't simply call it off and put the toothpaste back in the tube. So people like Michael Howard would say, this is a fundamental problem of the kind of era of the modern nation state, and that nationalism and warfare as an instrument of decision in a cleanly delineated way, as an effective or efficient instrument of decision. Those things are in tension. And this, I guess, kind of feeds into that thesis that we've all read about war being endless and it leading to ended protracted quagmires and low intensity conflict. This would seem to be part of that story. Does that help, or?
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
And if there's something we can follow out of there, we've got another question on the line from Captain Nathaniel, and he's come out with a really good one that follows nicely, is that as we go to these sorts of conflicts where, it's not necessarily that the population or the levée en masse, as you said, have put down their arms and agreed to cease the conflict. And his question goes to where to with anti-leadership operations. So anti-leadership operations where a military may seek to take out the command and control or the leadership, military or otherwise, of an organisation, thereby making it less effective in combat. However, that would, I guess, suggest that where he's going to with his question here is that it's going to be less effective in controlling the population and those forces after combat, potentially, as we saw in Iraq with demobilised forces and no leadership. And I was wondering if you could offer your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. So there's two elements to that question, and the first one, it operates on two registers. The first one, the very immediate sense, is there's a big debate at the moment about the use of force short of war, and one of the shift towards, small quantum uses of force, drone strikes, targeted killings, etc. One of the interesting questions coming out of that is, what does victory look like in this, and how does this produce any change on the ground that's meaningful and enduring? And this is something that ethicists seem to be engaging with quite a lot now. It speaks precisely to the problem that he identifies. The deeper lying historical point speaks to this idea that there is, I think, an intuitive notion that most of us naturally carry, that for a victory to count really as a victory, for it to truly count, it has to be a victory that's fairly won, that you've won fair and square. Cheating doesn't count. So you get this idea inscribed into the history of political thought, from the Greeks through Machiavelli, through Clausewitz as well, that unless you've actually beaten the other guy fair square in battle, unless you've fronted up and driven them off the battlefield, that this is somehow a cheaper or degraded victory. There's a nice interchange between Alexander the Great and one of his advisors, who suggests that he ambushes his enemy at night, and he says, I don't want to be embarrassed of my victories, for they'd count as defeats ultimately. No, I want to beat the other guy out there in the field so that everyone can see it and no one can ever take it away from me. So I think what we're talking about is there are these deep-lying normative intuitions about what a proper victory ought to look like that seems to be fused with a very outmoded or historical view of what warfare looks like, which doesn't really comport anymore. We don't have phalanxes meeting on a given day. So it's producing all of these kinds of problems. Does that make sense? The captain might wish to come back in it.
And I hope that answers your question, Nathaniel. We've got another one coming through, and this applies to a current conflict. So we're talking about Russia's war in Ukraine. And the question is can you apply this to the Ukraine conflict? And he's given us a double-barrel question. So is it possible to distinguish between the humiliation of Putin and the humiliation of Russia? And if we need to explore that a bit further, potentially it's like, well, as we go to that theory of victory, is Zelensky being clear enough in his theory of victory for Ukraine? Do we understand it? Does Ukraine understand it? And is it going to be a potential source of further grievance for Russia, as in, are we creating a new conflict that's potentially unresolvable?
Those are great questions again. So can you humiliate Putin but not Russia? I'd have my doubts. And I'd have my doubts because I'm a very uncomfortable just war theorist. So writing about just war theory is what I do, and being a just war theorist is in some sense how I'd self-identify. But I'm profoundly skeptical of a lot of just war theory because I think, and I'm coming back around to this question, I think what just war theory invites you to do is it invites you to think that war can be clean, right? And that you can, if you only follow the argument long enough and make the right steps, that you can somehow make this sanitary, and that there'll be no leftover, no remainder, no bitterness afterwards, no spillover, no blowback. But, of course, what just war theory is ultimately about is it's about how do you use a contest of might to resolve a question of right. There's a fundamental disconnect. It's a square peg in a round hole. And just war theorists don't want to confront that. So you keep ginning up the language and making it ever more elaborate so it looks prettier and prettier. And so you don't have to confront the fact that at the bottom, underneath it, you're still talking about war, which is a bloody and a brutish enterprise. And it involves killing people and blowing stuff up. And sometimes we might wish to do that and we might think it's justified. but it's never a pain-free exercise, and it's always fundamentally conflictual. And I think that the kind of idea that we can embarrass Putin but not Russia is precisely that kind of seduction that you buy into, and that encourages you to forget how blunt the tools at our disposal actually are, and that there will always be broken eggs and so forth. So, I mean, the aspiration is right. I like the thinking, and I think that's how we should be thinking about it, seeking to do one but not the other, but always remembering that the tools at our disposal don't, no matter what the theories might seduce you to believing, you're always likely to bring a bit of one with the other, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much, and I hope that answers a question for online. With that, I think we've been taking plenty of your time, and thank you for being so generous with it. And we'll draw it to a close there. So what I would like to take away, some of the key points is that, you know, it's not a binary, it's not a switch between peace and war. It's a little bit more complex than that, as is most of those things that we come out in these presentations, which is fantastic. And it's not just about here and now in the moment, and we are certainly not the only ones that are dealing with this problem, or we are just part of the whole tool set that needs to solve some of these complex problems. And indeed, some of these problems aren't necessarily military solutions or military-only solutions. So with that, we'll close out this presentation, and I just invite everybody who's online, do check out the Cove, find it on your social media. That's how we get after these good topics and these presenters. And if you do have any suggestions, please do engage with the Cove and come through so we can get more of these PME sessions up and good quality presentations. So thank you to everybody in the room. If you please join me in showing appreciation for Professor Augusto.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.